Okay, welcome back for the second and for today last keynote address. First, two quick announcements. One is that there is this. If somebody forgot it, it's yours. Okay, good. And the other one is a sort of apology. You may have noticed that it's kind of cold here. It is cold. It's not our fault in the sense that there was an act of vandalism a couple of months ago that affected the gas pipe. So people are a little bit worried about the security, and that's why they don't allow the use of gas. Of course, this one doesn't work again. That's fine. But anyway, these were the two announcements, so apologies, but there is really nothing you can do about it. Okay, back to business. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Pinzani, who is, first of all, a very good friend of mine, which is by far his most important title.
That's why I'm here.
No, that's not true. Jokes aside, Alessandro is professor of ethics and political philosophy at the Department of Philosophy at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Florianopolis, Brazil, affiliated with the Institute of Law, Politics and Development at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa, Italy, and currently joined the Institute for Creativity and Education Innovations at the University of Valencia, where he is spending 1 year as visiting professor there. He obtained his doctorate and habilitation in philosophy from the University of Tübingen and has held visiting, teaching, and research positions at several universities across Europe and Brazil, which I'm not going to list because there are too many. Since 2006, he has been a research collaborator with Brazil's National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. As many of you already know, Alessandro's research focuses on social philosophy, critical theory, social suffering, poverty, and democratic theory. And his work engages deeply with contemporary political and ethical issues, often examining the condition of citizenship, autonomy, and inequality. I'm going to mention a few of his numerous publications. Monograph an der Wurzel moderner Demokratie, Bürger und Staat in der Neuzeit, Jürgen Habermas, a monograph on Habermas that Habermas himself liked a lot, as he said publicly, and Alessandro considered one of his most important achievements. That's what he told me, at least. Money, Autonomy, and Citizenship for Springer in 2019, Kant and the Problem of Politics, Rethinking the Contemporary World, that he co-edited with a certain Caranti. So the title of his talk today is Needs and Social Critique. Thank you. Oh, you want to use this? Okay.
No, I can use this. Maybe it's better. So, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Good evening to everyone. Thank you, Luigi, for your kind words of presentation. I will immediately go to my text. I will mostly read it so that I will keep my time. But before I do it, I would like maybe to situate a little bit this presentation, in which I would like to bring back to the center of the philosophical discussion on society, a concept that has been rather neglected in recent decades, the concept of needs. Why this? Between 2005 and 2022, I participated in a couple of field research on poverty in Brazil. And during this research, we interviewed a lot of persons, of women, basically. There was just a couple of men who lived in poverty. And we studied the the subjective consequence, so the consequence of the subjectivity of these persons of living in poverty and participating in social programs and so on. And we interviewed, it was a qualitative, where this was qualitative interviews, so qualitative research. We interviewed hundreds of women, not a single one. One of the things we wanted to discuss with them is, why are you poor, or why there are poor people? I mean, of course, not in such a blunt way, but we wanted to arrive to this. And none of these women ever mentioned the word injustice or blame her situation to the fact that Brazilian society is extremely unjust and unequal. So they will explain it with many things, God's will, I am too bad, I'm too stupid, I mean, everything, but never the word is unjust or society is unjust. Second, they never mention the word rights. So they never claim it is my right to get, for instance, these social programs and so on. But for 5 women. And of these 5 women, only 2 actually had an idea of what really a right is. So in a sense, what struck me as the philosopher of the group, of the team, was the fact that we use as philosophers who make normative theories to think of individuals as right bearers. But these persons don't think of themselves as right bearers. So the point is, okay, we use the grammar of rights, but they don't. So how can we reach a common ground? And what I noticed is that they used another grammar, which is the grammar of needs. So while they weren't able to claim rights, they could very well articulate normative demands concerning the satisfaction of their needs. So that pushed me to the idea that maybe we should rethink a little bit our way of imagining what a society is, and therefore also social justice might be, around the concept of needs. So this was the prologue. So my aim in this talk, in this speech, is to sketch, only to sketch, the contours of a critical social theory according to which society exists to satisfy human needs and derives its legitimacy from doing so, or from convincing its members that it does so. So for this reason, I will bracket many questions. For instance, the distinction between needs and preferences or other issues. We can discuss them later if you want. And I will focus on the relationship between needs in the existence of society, as well as on the consequences of this relationship for a critical social theory. But first, let me begin with 2 clarifications. First, justice and decency, however one defines them, are not essential features of society. Their absence does not necessarily lead to the failure or dissolution of a society. There are many historical examples of societies that persisted for a long time despite being extremely unjust, at least by today's standards. By contrast, no society can persist without satisfying at least some needs of some of its members. For instance, even a society based on slavery must feed the slaves to remain functional. To make a very crude example that shows that, it doesn't have to be just. Therefore, satisfying needs, the needs of its members, doesn't make a society just. At best, it means that it is, at least for time being, a functioning society. A dystopian totalitarian government may adequately feed, clothe, and house its citizens while simultaneously depriving them of freedom and keep them under strict control. So the statement that a society satisfies the needs of its members is, in the first instance, a functional claim, not a normative evaluation concerning its fairness. Second clarification, we must distinguish between needs and necessities. Food, shelter, adequate clothing, participation in social life, social and moral recognition, and so on, are things that human beings require in order to exist, function, and develop. So necessities impose on us. We do not choose them. We do not choose to have certain necessities, although we might choose to satisfy them or not. So this has to do also with the distinction between needs and preference, but as I said, I won't go on it. That means that even what some authors in the literature has called unnatural or artificial needs, think of Rousseau or Marcuse, impose on us. So it is not up to us to have them or not, therefore we cannot be blamed to have these needs. So again, food, shelter, adequate clothing, etc., can be seen as the object of necessities. When resources are plentiful, satisfying necessities is relatively unproblematic. For instance, I have a necessity for food, for adequate nourishment. If I have food at the hand, this is not a problem. Or I have a need for love. If I have loving people around me, this is not a problem. When resources are scarce or unequally distributed, then normative questions inevitably arise. Necessities become needs. But what is a need in the end? Brian Barry famously argued that pointing to the existence of a need cannot in itself justify a normative claim. When we say that X is needed to achieve some end Y. Thus, according to Barry, the real justification concerns the end, not the need. This objection, however, rests on an ambiguity in our everyday language and requires a linguistic and conceptual clarification. If we say that José needs food, food is the means through which the José needs nourishment, nourishment is the goal to be achieved. If we say that José needs food, food is the means through which that goal is achieved. To avoid confusion, I will use the term need to designate the goal to be attained, in this case nourishment, and the term satisfier to designate the means, in this case food. So the precise formulation would be therefore be the following. Food as a satisfier is needed in order to achieve nourishment, which is the need to be satisfied. Once this distinction is clarified, needs cannot be dismissed as merely derivative means, as Barry does. Rather, they are the end to be reached. Now, once this point is established, we can attempt a more precise definition of what a need is. Most theories define needs through the concept of harm. Unmet needs cause harm. But harm cannot be defined purely in subjective terms, such as the frustration of individual preferences. It must have an objective dimension. Consider a chain smoker with serious cardiovascular problems who says, I need a cigarette. An impartial observer would conclude that, notwithstanding this subjective feeling of need, this person needs, objectively speaking, to stop smoking to avoid harm. But how are we to understand an objective harm? And how does it relate to needs? The case of biological needs may seem relatively unproblematic. Without adequate nutrition and access to clean water, human beings die. Apparently, one can exactly determine which nutrients and how much of them a person needs. Yet, even in this case, objectivity is never absolute. Individuals react differently to deprivation, even in this case, and it is difficult to determine precise thresholds that apply universally. Moreover, satisfiers are never purely material. They are culturally mediated. Every culture has taboos regarding food, for instance. Some prohibit pork or shellfish, others condemn eating certain animals, and many others forbid eating human flesh. What counts as acceptable nourishment depends not only on nutritional values, but also on shared cultural meanings. Even the most basic need, nutrition, has therefore a socio-cultural dimension that is as central as the material one. Many persons would rather starve than break food taboos, for instance, than practicing cannibalism. The same holds for other so-called basic needs, such as clothing and shelter. What counts as adequate clothing for someone living in Catania? Climate is relevant, but so are fashion or social expectations. Adam Smith famously observed that in 18th century England, a respectable worker was expected to wear a clean linen shirt, whereas in other societies, such a garment was not socially necessary. He mentioned India, where a laborer might wear a simple loincloth. The need for clothing cannot be defined independently of the social standards that determine what is required to participate without shame in one's community. Moreover, there are immaterial needs, such as the ones for love, recognition, or belonging. In all these cases, it is difficult to determine objectively how these needs should be defined in concrete terms and which satisfiers are appropriate. So it's not so easy to connect needs and harms as most theorists do. So my suggestion, to connect needs and harm more precisely, I draw on Andrzej Szyński, who conceives the person as a self-organizing system. So really a la Fumberta Lanfi. Yeah? He distinguishes 4 types of needs. First, needs whose non-satisfaction leads to the destruction of the system. We can call them existence needs. Second, needs whose non-satisfaction renders the system unable to perform certain functions. He calls them integration needs. Third, needs whose non-satisfaction causes dysfunctions in specific areas. He calls these needs for optimal functioning. Fourth, needs whose non-satisfaction disrupts the development of the system. Developmental needs. So in all these cases, you can see that Szyński say that when these needs are not satisfied, you have a harm that you can objectively state. Let me briefly illustrate these categories with examples applying them to both material and immaterial needs. Although Szyński thinks more of the first one. We will come back to this. So, first example, consider adequate nutrition, which is the classical example for the most basic need. Its complete absence, so the non-fulfillment of this need, leads to death, that is, non-existence. So, existence needs. Insufficient intake may cause weakness and prevent a person from performing basic activities, impairing the fulfillment not only of physical, but also of psychological, and I will add social functions. So these are the second category of needs, integration needs. An unbalanced diet may impair optimal functioning. So if I have an unbalanced diet, maybe I won't able to make sport. Yeah? So needs for optimal functioning. And finally, long-term malnutrition during childhood may severely hinder intellectual and physical development. So the non-satisfaction of this need results in forms of harm that can be stated objectively and concern the existence, functioning, optimal functioning, and development of the system, to use Szyński's word. The same structure, however, applies to immaterial needs. even though their non-satisfaction may not immediately appear to lead to the destruction of the system. We will think, okay, if an immaterial need is not satisfied, I won't die for this reason. Yes, but think of psychological disorders such as anorexia or severe paranoia, which may indeed have fatal consequences. So consider the need for self-respect. Its non-satisfaction may prevent a person from engaging in even the most basic forms of social interaction, like speaking to a stranger or even go on the street. It may impair specific capacities for advanced form of social interaction, such as forming stable relationships. Over time, it may block personal development altogether. A person might allow their intellectual capacities to wither because they believe they will never achieve anything meaningful, which is actually something that we heard a lot during the interviews that we did in this field of research. So, even in the case of immaterial needs, we can have objective harms. Needs thus differ not only in content, but also in the degree and type of harm that their non-satisfaction produce, as well as in the aspects of a person's functions it affects. While Sitzinski primarily refers to a system's material functions, I suggest expanding this concept to include social functions. These are defined within specific social and cultural contexts and may be expressed in statements such as, in society X, people are expected to fulfill functions A, B, C, and so on. Every society establishes expectations regarding what individuals should be able to do and to be. Even biological functions are embedded in cultural interpretations. Consider, for example, having a child. This can be interpreted as a biological urge, a patriotic duty, as a contribution to financing the pension system. We hear this very often in Europe, as obedience to divine commandment, or as a step toward self-realization. In other words, the definition of a person's functions, and therefore of the corresponding needs, depends primarily on their social role and the normative expectation of their society, and only secondarily on biographical or personal characteristics. In other words, the key issue here is the impact of unmet needs on people's existence, functions, and development as defined within their sociocultural context. And this could provide criteria for determining which needs must be satisfied and to what extent, and how to diagnose the harm resulting from their non-satisfaction. So basically, what I am suggesting here is that we adopt a new social ontology, different, for instance, from Sitzinski's idea of individuals as system, but also different from the traditional view that we have due to methodological individualism. So, according to this view, individuals have needs. So, like you have a substrate, the individual, to which accidental needs apply. In my view, individuals are bundles of needs. That means they are defined by the necessities that their natural and social environment impose on them. Strictly speaking, one should say, we shouldn't say, I have needs X, Y, Y, it needs Y, Z, but we should say, I'm shaped, my identity is shaped by needs X, Y, and Y. And these needs, again, are imposed on me by my natural and social environment. So, concluding this first part, needs can be defined as conditions relating to a person's necessities whose insufficient satisfaction causes objective harm, although this objectivity is socially mediated. They concern a person's capacity to exist, fulfill basic physical, psychological, and social functions, fulfill this function optimally, and develop the physical, psychological, and social capacities necessary for doing so. Needs, therefore, cannot be understood as fixed once and for all, as many theorists tend to do. They make a list of needs, even though some are shared by all human beings or even by all living beings, such as the need for nourishment. Because needs are socially defined and intersubjectively shaped, they are unavoidably objects of conflict, both with respect to their definition and to their satisfaction. This leads us to discuss their social and political character. In the second and third parts of my lecture, I will therefore discuss these features of needs. I will consider the role of natural language and the relationship between nature and culture, and then address the historical, social, and, in the third part, political dimension of needs. Two kinds of normativity are associated with need satisfaction. When we claim that the child must eat to avoid the harm of malnutrition, we refer to factual necessity. When we say that the child ought to be fed, we refer to moral necessity. To understand how we can move from must claims to ought to claims, we must consider the role of language within culture. We use language not only to communicate, that's why I introduced the idea of the grammar of needs that I mentioned before. So we use language not only to communicate with each other or to express our inner states, as other animals do, but also to explain the world around us and to justify our actions. Human beings are creatures who give reason, a definition our common friend Rainer Forst would probably love. These reasons do not have to be rational in the sense of the classical Western concept of rationality. They may refer to shared metaphysical or religious beliefs, moral norms, ethical ideas, and so on. It is not necessary here to address the question of how and when, during natural evolution, the species Homo sapiens developed this capacity to use language in such a way. What matters is that it provided the basis for the development of culture that I understand here as something more than the emergence of certain habits or tools. Culture is a way of interpreting the environment, giving it meaning, explaining natural and social phenomena, and offering reasons to justify norms and patterns of behavior. Therefore, culture is essential to the definition of needs. The idea that the differentia specifica of the human being lies in the capacity to give linguistically formulated reasons is central to a needs-based theory. Through language, humans thematize their needs and develop normative demands related to them. Linguistically formulated claims about needs stand at the center of human communication and sociality. They form the core of our identity as a species and as individuals. In this sense, reasoning about needs lies at the heart of our Menschenwertung, of our becoming human, both at the phylogenetic and the ontogenetic levels. On the phylogenetic level, Homo sapiens became different from other species by creating complex cultural explanation of needs and their satisfaction. Hegel writes a lot about this. In a certain sense, strictly speaking, there are no natural needs. Not because the human being is not natural. Humans are animals and as such have biological needs like any other animal. But because the way in which those natural needs are defined and satisfied is culturally and socially shaped, and this shaping outweighs their biological basis. In other words, needs have both a history and a story. They have developed historically along with Homo sapiens. The history of the development of human needs coincides, as thinkers like Rousseau or Hegel have suggested, with the history of humanity itself. Human beings do not have an immediate relationship to nature, either to the external environment or to their own bodies. They always stand in a culturally and therefore socially mediated relationship to it. Human history shows how we continually invent new ways to satisfy both material and immaterial needs. For these reasons, needs also have a story. They have been defined and justified in always new ways by every human culture through linguistically formulated narratives. These narratives have taken the form of sacred scriptures, legal and moral norms, literary texts, political manifestos, and theoretical writings from Plato to the present day. Once again, language is an essential element of humanity in every sense of the term. On the ontogenetic level, we become the persons we are by learning to advance linguistically formulated claims about our needs. I want to emphasize that this is a learning process. Babies express bodily needs for care and protection through crying and gesturing. They cannot yet give reasons for normative claims. But as they grow and learn a natural language, they can articulate their needs linguistically. And these articulations become the basis of normative expectations. This means that linguistic mediation is necessary for transforming demands concerning the satisfaction of needs, which might be expressed through must claims, the factual normativity, into normative claims, that is, into ought-to claims. These transformations occurs when we become aware that we depend on others to satisfy our needs. Psychologically speaking, when the child abandons its original narcissism and realizes that the world is not at their disposal, but is a place they can navigate only with the help of others. In other words, as we become aware that we are embedded in a broader social context and dependent on others, the baby's simple cry for help becomes a linguistically mediated normative demand addressed to others, whose cooperation we expect. This is crucial for the critical theory of needs. It is not social or political philosophers who ground normative demands about needs, for instance, by making a list. Rather, individuals themselves justify their claims by expressing their needs linguistically, thereby opening a process of negotiation with others. And these claims must find acceptance within the relevant social environment in which they are formulated, and which might be the family, the local community, or the state. This highlights the needs complex objective and social character, which appears at several levels. The first level is that of cultural language, which I have already mentioned. Cultures define needs and their satisfiers. Needs are embedded in cultural interpretations of our relationship to ourselves and to the world. For this reason, human beings cannot justify their action simply by pointing to the necessity of satisfying their needs, as in the case of factual must normativity. Instead, they are compelled to situate these needs, their needs and their strategies of satisfaction within a broader cultural framework, that is, within a collectively recognized system of beliefs and values. Only in this way can they formulate their needs as normative claims in the moral sense, as ought-to claims. This means that the reference to a need can count as a justification for an action or as a justification for a claim on society only, and only if, I would say, it is acceptable within a given and social reason. Needs may factually motivate our actions, but they become reasons for actions only within a specific linguistic, cultural, and social context. For instance, the fact that a person needs adequate food and clean water to survive may motivate them to act, but it does not in itself constitute a reason why the community should provide them with satisfiers, or why the community should accept that this person resort to theft in order to get food. To obtain approval from the social environment, people must appeal to something other than the mere existence of their needs. In some cultures, this will be the idea of human dignity, in others the idea of fraternity or solidarity, in others the idea that we have innate individual rights or a duty to support each other as children of the same God. Different cultures have offered different principles to justify which needs and satisfiers are acceptable and to determine which social actors are responsible for making satisfiers available. All these answers, however, share a common element. And this is for me the relevant point as a philosopher and not as a sociologist or historian or society, for instance, which I am not. So all these answers share a common element. They conceive of society, whether understood as family, clan, local community, national community, or even international community, as something that exists precisely to help its members satisfy their needs. There might be divergence concerning which member needs count, whether those of all or only of some people, but the shared assumption is that society bears responsibility for satisfying the needs of its members. This is a peculiar premise. On the one hand, it appears to be a factual claim, an assertion about what societies are and historically have always been. On the other hand, the claim that society exists to help its members satisfy their needs has an implicit normative character in a quasi-Aristotelian sense. The fulfillment of this task becomes its telos, the realization of its nature or essence. From both perspectives, a society that does not live up to this idea is a failed society, one that has ceased to be a proper society and is prone to external conquer, internal strife, and ultimately collapse. However, this does not mean that it has become a collection of isolated individuals who interact only intermittently. This scenario has been described by some philosophers, such as Rousseau, but this is, or actually the whole contractarians, but it is entirely implausible. Not only has it never been observed in human history, but it also overlooks an essential point, which brings us to another level at which needs reveal their social nature. Generally speaking, individuals cannot satisfy their needs alone. They rely on the cooperation of others. They need society in order to meet their needs. This is most obvious in the case of needs that concern interpersonal relationships, like love, recognition, admiration, respect, and so on. Clearly, we need to be loved, admired, or respected by others, even if these others are not physically present, as in the case of dead ancestors or gods. But this is also true for highly individualized needs connected to physical existence. Only in exceptional and temporary situations can individuals ensure their survival entirely on their own. In general, however, we require the cooperation of others to attain this basic goal. This is obviously true of babies, children, and fragile elderly persons, but even able-bodied adults depend on others to provide the means for their survival and for the survival of their family and group. To satisfy our needs, we must then cooperate with others. Cooperation which can take different forms. I mean, in traditional society, generally, people satisfy their needs through collective work, hunting, gathering, cultivating land, raising cattle, even caring for children. In societies, we are highly specialized social division of labor. People rely on the satisfier produced by others and exchange it on a market. So individuals do not need to hunt or grow their food, to weave their clothes or build their houses. They can exchange the satisfiers they need for the satisfiers that they produce and other needs. And in capitalist societies, as we know, this exchange takes place through money, the universal equivalent form. In any case, the satisfaction of needs presupposes interaction with other individuals. We depend on others to meet our needs. And this dependency begins with the fetus in the mother's womb and ends only in the grave. For this reason, when we seek cooperation for satisfy our needs, we must formulate our claims in a way that allow others to recognize their needs as reasons to provide on their part the relevant satisfiers, to cooperate with us. Therefore, the object of a critical theory of needs is not so much the factual satisfaction of needs as their justified, collectively recognized satisfaction. That is, the fact that they function as socially accepted reasons. What is at stake here is not only the definition of socially acceptable needs, but also the definition of socially acceptable satisfiers and the identification of the relevant social actors who are expected to make these satisfiers available. And this three definition, the definition and identification, is the result of justificatory practices that ultimately take the form of political discourses. For this reason, a social theory of needs unavoidably leads to a political theory of needs, one that focuses on the mechanism regulating the process of defining acceptable needs and satisfiers and identifying the relevant social actors. In the third and final part of my lecture, I will therefore touch on this issue. To do so, I will begin by drawing on the analysis that Nancy Fraser and Lawrence Hamilton had devoted to the political mechanism through which needs are defined. Fraser proposes focusing not on needs themselves, but on discourses about needs and on the politics of their interpretation. To capture this, Fraser introduced the concept of means of interpretation and communication, or MICs. MICs are the discursive resources through which members of a society formulate and contest claims about needs. They include legitimate languages, for instance, the language of individual rights that we are usually utilize in our society, available vocabularies, feminist vocabularies, therapeutic vocabulary, administrative vocabulary, accepted paradigms of argumentation, rational arguments, emotional appeals, reference to tradition, and so on, narrative conventions that shape social identities, for instance, who counts as a citizen or who counts as a poor person, and modes of subjectification that position speakers, that defines who is who within society. What does it mean to be an individual? What is a social group? And so on. Because contemporary societies are deeply stratified, according to Fraser, access to these resources, to the mix, is unequal, giving dominant groups a structural advantage in publicly defining needs. Within this framework, Fraser distinguished three types of discourse. First, oppositional discourses, which arise from below and politicize previously naturalized needs, as feminist and labor movements have done. Second, reprivatizing discourses, which seek to restore traditional interpretation and to depoliticize these claims. Third, expert discourses, which translate politicized needs into administrable categories, often resulting in technocratic depoliticization. Fraser's example is the violence in domestic violence. So the feminist movement tried to politicize domestic violence, to make it an object of public policies, while the reprivatizing discourse was trying to do the opposite, to say, no, this is something that remains in the family. The state shouldn't take care of this. And then the result was the intervention of the state through administrative measure that led to expert discourses. So Fraser concludes by arguing that for the need to repoliticize discourses on needs so that needs remain objects of democratic deliberation and social critique. The challenge, however, is to devise forms of political struggle capable of countering the hegemony of reprivatizing and expert discourses and of reducing the distortions produced by unequal access to mix. In other words, Fraser herself is recognizing that due to the inequality of access to mix, it's difficult to have oppositional discourses. So one possible avenue in this direction is offered by Lawrence Hamilton, the South African philosopher Lawrence Hamilton, who proposed what he called institutional consequentialism. So Hamilton aims to offer a realistic, institutionally grounded theory that acknowledges the role of power, coercion, and social structures. It suggests that institutions should be evaluated by their effects on need satisfaction. So we evaluate whether the state, when we evaluate the state, we see whether the state is able to satisfy needs. And on the fair distribution of normative power. To this end, he proposes a census of needs and role. What is this? It's a mechanism through which individuals can identify and communicate their needs, enabling institutions to adapt and correct structural inequalities. So in a way of democratizing the discourses on needs. The evaluation of needs thus become a collective and institutional process initiated by people through political action rather than a purely moral or abstract exercise carried out by theorists. So the proposal of Fraser and Hamilton provide essential tools for a political theory of needs. Both emphasize the importance of individuals and groups claiming new interpretation of their needs, or new definitions of satisfiers and of those responsible for providing them. At the same time, both recognize that power asymmetries severally hinder the articulation of such claims. As far as the concept of mixme is clear, discursive resources are profoundly unequally distributed, especially in societies marked by large economic, political, and epistemic gaps. This inequality is reflected, for instance, in the ways people living in poverty describe their needs and formulate their demands while confronting reprivatizing discourses and, most of all, expert discourses imposed by public institutions without prior consultation. Poor people are object of policies, but they rarely are subject of politics. Under such conditions, the politicization of needs is highly unlikely, although not impossible. For similar reasons, the kind of census of needs and roles envisioned by Hamilton also appears unfeasible. In many Latin American, African, or Asian countries, there is no institutional framework capable of approximating the mechanism for planning and implementing social policies Hamilton proposes. At best, one may imagine a weak welfare state that treats citizens as clients or patients in present terms. In other words, inequalities within the mix undermine the procedural conditions for political participation. A situation which is not limited to low-income countries. Even in wealthier societies, certain groups have a very limited capacity to make themselves heard in debates about needs. This is particularly true of groups whose members do not perceive themselves as a group at all, such in the case of people living in poverty or unemployment. These persons tend to privatize their needs and individualize their situation, preventing the emergence of oppositional discourses and blocking their participation in any census of needs. Considering this, and I'm finishing, a critical theory of needs can intervene in several ways and follow at least 3 strategies. The first strategy is advocacy. Speaking on behalf of silenced groups, as political parties, social institutions, and NGOs often do, although the people concerned rarely choose those who speak from them. So you have an NGO speaking on behalf of a special group, but it is not often or always never the case that this group is giving this authorization. The risk here are the lack of representativity and therefore legitimacy, and the formation of expert discourses, as Fraser words, or a non-democratic sense of on needs and rules, and Hamilton would say. The second strategy is voicing, building analysis on what participants in field research say, and giving public presence to their voices, even if the reach of such voicing is limited by constraints such as the mentioned lack of awareness of forming a social group or the scarce access to mix. This is basically the strategy that we follow with my colleague sociologists in our research. The risk here is to have higher participation on the one hand, but a non-qualified or even distorted one on the other. The third strategy is catalyzing, acting as a catalyst, facilitating processes of collective articulation through mutual learning processes. The strategy too has limited impact for similar reasons as the other strategies. The limited access to resources and so on. But it underscores the need for institutional mechanism of the kind Hamilton calls for. That is, mechanisms that listen to those affected before designing policies and enable them to better understand their needs or formulate their demands. I'm thinking here, for instance, of institutional mechanisms like those of deliberative democracy. I mean, not just the general theory of deliberative democracy, but when they have tried to concretely apply the model. In conclusion, none of these strategies is sufficient on its own. Advocacy without accountability risks epistemic or even political domination. Voicing without epistemic competence risks reinforcing existing inequalities. Catalyzing without institutional support risks remaining ephemeral. Taken together, however, they point toward a critical practice oriented not only toward interpretation, but toward enabling a kind of political agency that is closer to lived experience and open to collective transformation. Thank you very much for your attention.